Hey, church, so good to be back with you for another week. We just have a few quick announcements I want to let you know before we get into the service. First is at the end of the month on October 31st, we have our trunk or treat. It's going to be such a great event. We want you to come out, bring your friends, bring your family, or if you're interested in being a part of it and you want to decorate one of your trunks, this is such a great way to get involved in Burnett life and then serve our community, where we're going to have people coming out and giving out candy to the community. And it's just going to be such an amazing time. It's going to be on the 31st. It's going to be from 5 to 7. Myself and our life group, we're going to be doing LA street dogs, which just means bacon wrapped hot dogs for the parents, because you're not going to be able to go door to door and get candy. Well, I mean, unless you want it, but it might be a little awkward. So come hang out with us. It's going to be great. And then we have our women's conference coming up the weekend of Trunk or Treat, just before we go. It's going to be an amazing thing for our women. Pastor Mel has been working so hard on it. It's going to be so fantastic. If you want any information, head over to our website, burnettchurch.com. But let's get ready for service today as Pastor Tim opens up a new series called Real and Our Relationship with the Church.
Let me ask you a quick question as we dive in this morning, because what we're going to do this month is we're going to have a conversation about the church and relationships, okay? And if we're real, sometimes the church and relationships can be challenging, right? Our church has grown and changed dramatically over the last 18 months. And so it seems to me to be a good idea to just get real with one another, have a bit of a conversation. What does it mean to be together? What do I think that the church is called to as a body? And how do we bridge the gap? Sometimes between our expectations for church and the reality of, other human beings. To get us thinking and involved and unloaded, I want to ask you a question this morning. Think back to the last wedding you went to, okay? Last wedding you went to. When you were at that wedding, did they ask, if anybody objects to this marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace? If they did, can you put up your hand? Okay, if they didn't, can you put up your other hand? Right. It's becoming more and more common to leave that out, whereas, a generation ago, that was a really common question at just about every wedding, as I understand. I think I know why people stopped asking that question. Have you ever been the person who had reservations about somebody that one of your friends was marrying? Have you ever told them so? I had some friends when I was in university. I had been friends with her for quite some time, 7 or 8 years. We enjoyed a fantastic friendship. I had left the Maritimes, gone to school in Calgary. She stayed behind for a little while and then joined the school that I had been going to because it was connected to our church, and our relationship grew through church. And so when she decided to come out, she would call me every once in a while that summer, and we would just talk about what she could expect, what dorm life was going to be like, which professors she wanted to try to avoid at all costs, try to give her the heads up for how to be successful. Well, one day when we were talking, one of my friends was there. And she kind of picked up on the fact that he was in the room, and so she asked if she could talk to him. And I said, yeah, sure, okay, great. So Kelly and Clayton met over the phone, and I could tell almost instantly that there were sparks. Proved to be true, because within a month of her coming out to our college, she started dating this guy I knew called Clayton. Now, Clayton was a great college buddy. We did some amazing things together. Probably the most epic thing he and I did was one day he said, hey, it's lunchtime, I want steak, and I have some extra money. Let's go to High's Steakhouse in downtown Calgary. I was like, cool, do we need to get changed? He's like, nope. We were in college garb, sweatpants, hoodies. We were not dressed for a high-end steakhouse. We went through the front door, and the maitre d' looked at us and did this, and then said, can I help you? And Clayton was like, yep, we want steak. And we sat down amongst all these business people doing all these deals in all of their suits, dressed like total. We probably didn't wash the sweats in several days because we were college dudes, so, why would you do laundry if you don't have to? And just, Clayton was a great wingman for adventure, but he wasn't terribly responsible. He wasn't terribly good at keeping his word. He didn't seem super motivated. He didn't seem like the kind of guy to me that my friend should marry. And I told her so. It's been 22 years since I talked to her. And that's why we don't ask people that question at weddings anymore. But sometimes, here's the great lesson that I learned. The great lesson that I learned is you can't disapprove of somebody's choice of mate and still maintain a relationship with them. You can't disapprove of somebody's choice for marriage and still have a functional relationship with them. If they are really committed to getting married to that person. Now, there are those occasions where you would go and you would speak your version of wisdom and truth, and they would agree with you, and then they would break up, and I guess that is probably worth the risk. But if they don't agree with you, the relationship's probably finished, right? Here's the really tough thing. I think sometimes when it comes to, this is the getting real part, when it comes to the church and Jesus, what I have experienced as a pastor is that people love Jesus, right? And why wouldn't you love Jesus? He first loved you, he came and he died for you, all of those things. But sometimes it feels like, well, we want Jesus without his bride. And that doesn't mean that we're not here, because obviously all of you are here at church. But is it really the version of the bride that Jesus wants us to embrace? Is it the relationship with his church that he would want for us? And I get it. Sometimes I daydream about my perfect church. Do you ever do this? Do you ever let your mind wander? This is probably just a pastor thing, but maybe you've done it before too. Right? We would come through into the parking lot, and the parking lot would be freshly paved and freshly painted. You would get out of your car, and of course there would be a space for you right at the front door, because it would be raining, because we're in the Lower Mainland, but you wouldn't get wet because your parking spot was right next to the front door. You would come into the front vestibule, and it would be bright and open and spacious, and yet warm and inviting and lovely. You would come in to the auditorium, and the seats would always be in good repair. They would always be straight. This is one of my pet peeves. They would be theater-style, big, resting. You could even lean back when the pastor got bored. Or boring. Excuse me. Which never happens. I know none of you ever fall asleep while I'm speaking. When the lights and the technology were turned on, they would only be deployed in a way that you appreciated. They would never offend your sensibilities. The guy running the sound would never have things too loud, right? You would love every song we sing, and all of the musicians would play every note perfectly. The guy running the soundboard would never forget to turn the host mic on or grab the wrong fader and push the wrong one up while he's trying to speak, and it would take 3 times, and we would have a big joke about it. That would never happen, right? And when the pastor got up to speak, oh man, he would always give exactly the message that you needed to hear. And I haven't even talked about the people yet. When you came through the front door, that person who greet you, they would intuitively know if you're a fist pumper, an elbow bumper, a high fiver, a handshaker, or a hugger. You would never have to make it known by the look on your face when they come to give you that hug, and they're like, I'm not a hugger. They would know every single time. Nobody would ever say anything weird or do anything wrong. And when you were encouraged by the church to get involved in a ministry or a group, every single person there would be just like your ideal best friend. Everything would be, have you ever done this before? Doesn't that sound amazing, right? But would my version of church accomplish Jesus' purpose for the church in my life? That's the question that I want to ask. Would our perfect version of church, if God gave us everything we wanted, if it was so comfortable and easy to be involved in church, would it do what God wants to do in our lives? During the month of October, we're going to spend some time having these real conversations in the hopes of finding some real answers to bridge the gap between the beauty and the imperfections of church life. My hope is that ultimately we will all choose a relationship with Christ and the bride that he has chosen. in her realness and imperfections. To do that, I want to open up 1 Peter chapter 2 this morning. If you have a Bible, you're welcome to open it with me. If you have a digital version on your phone, that's totally okay. If you didn't bring any and you want to watch on the screen, go ahead and do that, because we'll put it up there too. I'm going to read out of this. I like the old analog version. I'm going to start at verse 4. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame." Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. There are a lot of things that we could say coming out of that passage, and the first one might seem totally obvious, is that the church is all about Jesus. It's 100% all about Jesus. And you might just go, well, Pastor Tim, we know that. Except when we make our preferences the thing that decides whether we're going to really engage, really get involved, really dive in. See, we make the minor issues the major one. And we supplant Jesus as the most important thing about the church. His purposes, his desire for us, that's what should come first. It would be like going to the grocery store. I don't know how many of you are susceptible to marketing in a very special way. I've never known anybody like this. I'm not speaking about anybody in particular. But if you go to the grocery store and you fill your cart full of those things on the end of the aisle, you know when you go there and they just have such an incredible deal that you just can't see? If you went to the grocery store to get groceries and you filled your cart full of toothpaste because it was on sale, you would have forgotten why you were there. The lost leader would make it so that you had missed your entire purpose. And sometimes all of these things, which incidentally, Jordan and I and Melissa and Quinn spend a ton of time trying to make sure that the church is an enjoyable place for you to come. But if you're still kind of holding it out at arm's length from time to time, because of the strangeness of the relationships and the difficulty of the task at hand of being connected to something imperfect, it's like going to the store and buying too much toothpaste. Because what we're supposed to be doing is we are called together to be a priesthood declaring the praises of who? Jesus Christ. Not declaring our preferences over the calling that he's put on us, not declaring anything else but Jesus and Jesus alone. The priests were given a very specific task. That's a word that can be challenging for us because, of course, we've had thousands of years of the Catholic Church. And so priest is kind of like, we think of them as wearing robes and a collar. But when Peter uses priests in this particular passage, there are two things I think especially that we need to think about as it comes to what's our role and how do we be a faithful church together. There's mediation and education. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, that each one of us who's involved in the church is called to be somebody who represents God. This was God's intentionality for humanity from the very beginning, right? In the very beginning, God made man and woman what? In his image. He imparted to us a piece of who he is so that we could represent him to those we come in contact with. Priests are supposed to create bridges for people between God and man. Not that we're able to impart salvation on anybody, but it's more like, hey, we have a story to tell. We have a piece of the puzzle, and when we share that with other people, we create bridges for them to know. We're also called to know Christ, because this whole thing is about him, and tell people about him in a way that actually helps them get to know who he is. Mediation in education. Some of you who are technologically astute may have noticed that I've got a different way of dealing with my notes this morning. I went to the Apple store for the first time in a really, really long time. I've told you before, I used to live there, quite literally. I used to work for Apple, and it's been a decade probably since I went to an Apple store. The last computer I bought online. I was reminded again when I got there how intentional these guys are about giving you somebody who can actually show you what it looks like to be an Apple owner, right? Because Apple doesn't sell products as much as they sell involvement in a community. They talk about ecosystems, and they talk about culture a lot. And so I walked in, and I met one of the things that they really, really value is diversity. And for the first time in my whole life, I met a young man who was quite obviously Chinese. He had a long beard. He looked like Confucianism might have been his religion, except he was wearing a Jewish hat. I mean, it was in that moment, a cacophony of cultures kind of colliding and coming at me, and I realized, one of the reasons why this guy represents Apple, because it's a huge value for them. He was mediating for me in that moment who Apple chooses to be. And then he did a really, really great job of educating me on all the things that this device could do for me that maybe my current device doesn't. Gave me all of the insights, taught me about this groovy pencil, which I used to call a pen. It's not a pen, it's a pencil. I got all my education and everything that I needed. Now, there's a really important thing to understand about the way that Apple trains their employees. Is that the first thing is that sometimes when we think about mediation, we're always thinking externally. Right? We get that being a part of the church is supposed to involve some kind of evangelism, some kind of like telling people outside the church the goodness of God. But do you know that when we're trained at Apple, as much emphasis as they put on the external customer, they also put on the internally facing customers? Because make no mistake, if you work at Apple, you're buying more devices than the average human being. It's kind of part of the mean trick they play on you. They pay you, and then they expect you to give it back when you buy your iPhone or your computer. They give you a discount. They make it seem like a really good idea. Jordan and I were laughing about this week. Like, do you remember when you worked at Apple and like a new thing would come out and you just like shook with anticipation about the new iPhone, right? Because you had bought one on a discount, and what happens after that is they offer you so many discounts that you can just sell that phone and buy another one. So like, there's a period in our lives where we just, every new iPhone that came out, you get super pumped up because you buy a new iPhone. Every new iPad that comes out, you buy a new iPad. Every new computer that comes out, you buy a new computer. Everybody who works at Apple is also a customer. And so the way that we treat the people around us as employees is just as important as the way that we think about and treat people externally. The church is designed to be the same way. Sometimes we can forget that when God puts you here, it's for a purpose. When we're put together, He's building something, a spiritual house, to do the work that He wants to do in the world. And so our relationship, not just to the outside world, but to each other, is massively important. Absolutely critical. Why are we being put together? We're being put together for the purposes of building something that God wants to use in the world. This is where Peter starts to use the terminology about a cornerstone. Are you familiar with what a cornerstone actually is? Now, there are cornerstones that you see that are like decorative cornerstones. You'll see these in churches a lot, actually, especially quite old churches. You know, when they build or rebuild or rededicate, they'll put a special stone and they'll put the dates on it, when the stone was laid and all that kind of stuff. That is a kind of cornerstone, but it's not the cornerstone that Peter's talking about here. When Peter talks about cornerstone in this passage, he's talking about the masonry way of using a cornerstone, which means you put a stone down and you make sure that it's true and right, and it sets the agenda for every other stone that's going to be put together with it. And all of what God is doing in the church is referencing Christ as that chief cornerstone and going, how can I involve you in what He's doing, the trajectory that He set, the purposes that He have. All the other stones are set in reference to Christ. They're laid in formation. And the idea is that not only are we laid in relation to Christ, because just us and a cornerstone wouldn't be a church. In order to have a church, you need more stones. And when those stones are laid on top and put on sides, they create some version of pressure and formation. In old days, the bricks wouldn't have been entirely true, and so there was a bonding together of the process. That when God came and set us next to the other stones, the idea is that we, through that pressure and through that being set next to each other, actually get formed. Formation requires two different elements. It requires pressure and it requires time. His purpose for us here in forming this building is, yes, to form something that can mediate outward, but it's also to do a work in our lives, to make us like the cornerstone. As we living stones come to the stone, see, there's a intentional idea that God is trying to move us towards being like him. So in our passage, the other stones, they set pressure. And by God's Spirit, the mortar, we end up staying together. You can change the formula for formation by changing the variables in the formula, right? You might be like, I'm not sure that I'm down. Is there any way to speed this up? You might be thinking that yourself right now. Is there any way to speed this up? Yeah, you can speed it up. Do you know what's required in order to speed up the formation process? More pressure. Think about it this way. If you wanted to change the shape of a tree, you could have put it in Nova Scotia this week while the hurricane came through, and the tree will change shape. But it doesn't look like a very pleasant process. I was thinking about this a lot this week. My mom and dad live in Nova Scotia. I have a number of friends and family who still live on PEI. You ask any one of them if they want their trees to change shape by the wind, they probably don't. Because the problem with speeding up the formation process is that it often requires or produces trauma in somebody's life. No, if we wanted to actually shape something, we need time to do its work. Which is why settling ourselves into a church, even in all of its imperfections, is God's intention for us. God's intention to form us and shape us into what he wants takes time. And even though the church is not perfect, no church is perfect. Burnett's not perfect, no other church is perfect. What we have to do at some point is decide to allow time to do its work. Changing a tree is much less traumatic if you give it time. Some time ago, I started to become fascinated and interested in bonsai trees. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but you know what a bonsai tree is. You know what it looks like at the end of its life, right? Do you know that they don't grow that way? I didn't know that. I didn't know that bonsai trees don't grow in funny shapes. Bonsai trees grow straight up and down, like every other tree. The way that they get their shape, you see what's going on here? Little wires have been attached all the way around the tree. And those wires exert a pressure. And that pressure, given enough time, reshapes the tree. Gentle pressure over a long period of time. Listen to master bonsai artists talk about the art of forming this and see if you can make any parallels to spiritual life.
When you engage in something where you are pushing the limit of a living thing's ability to survive for the purpose of creating something even more beautiful than what existed prior to that engagement, the relationship and the bond that forms in that creative process and walking the line of life and death is something that is, I don't know if you could duplicate. And then to see the tree survive and to see the tree respond, for it to get more healthy, for it to grow into that design, for it to communicate back to you what it liked and didn't like, and then to respond to that again. And this back and forth collaboration until the conversation becomes so similar, the tree has taken on what you were hoping for, and you've taken on what the tree is hoping for. You know, you've closed the gap in that collaboration.
God's purpose in collaborating with us is twofold: to make known the beauty of his glory, but also to shape and form us. It's a conversation that he invites us into. And yes, it requires pressure, which is why the church requires other people, not like us. Diversity is intentional. Challenge is intentional. We're still called to be together. Jesus' vision for the church is that our lives would be formed for his purposes, for his glory. The question that we have to ask ourselves constantly is, we have a version of church in our head that we want. Would we exchange it for Jesus' vision of what the church should be, of what our lives should be? If we're being real with each other, which is part of what we're trying to do today, it's not easy. It's not simple. But do we trust that God has a purpose for us and a plan, and that purpose and plan is good? Listen to these words. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Do we believe that the life that God has designed and intended for us is beautiful, is like stepping out of darkness and into light? Will we make our life as members of any church, this one or any other, about Christ and his glory? Because once you weren't a people, but now, because of your relationship to that cornerstone, because of the building process that God has put us through, you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Last Sunday, we talked a little bit about the vision for our church. We talked a lot about story. And we said that what we want to do is that put our lives together in such a way that they would tell a story of Christ's love that the world actually wants to hear. I believe that's what he wants for us. I believe that he has a purpose and a plan for this church uniquely, for our friends and our neighbors, and for each other. My question, my challenge this morning is, will we decide together to be the church that Jesus wants to form? Will we allow him the time? Will we stand some of the pressure that's required to be formed into the image of Christ? There's a really simple thing I want you to do today. If it's your intention to make this your community, if you're wanting to go with us on a journey to be formed into something that Jesus intends, it's a really simple thing. I've been talking about it for a couple of weeks. We're ready to let you in on it now. Our pathway is available on our website. This is a simple, straightforward, robust way for people to be able to take steps on their spiritual journey. If you want to join us on that journey, I invite you to go to our website, burnettchurch.com. There's a tab right at the top, Pathway. Just sign up. You don't have to take any further steps than that right now if you don't want to. But get signed up, because we're going to start talking about this together a lot. How these steps that we're taking are part of the journey that God wants to use to form us. I would just invite you to go to that site, create your account. If you want, you can be really keen. There's a spiritual fitness test there that'll give you some ideas about where you are and maybe some of the areas in your life that you want to start focusing on. You could do that as well. But we want to make sure that this lands in a place where it's like, okay, that sounds nice, but now what? We want to be on a journey together. We want to be formed together. We want to be made into the image of Christ, and a church that can declare the beauty of his glory and his mercy. Let's sing together as we wrap up today.